In the spring of 2023, a wildlife biologist named Karen Krebs was conducting a routine survey near the Salt River east of Phoenix, Arizona, when she spotted something that made her stop walking and stand very still for a long moment. Perched in a large cottonwood tree above the river, wings folded, watching the water with the specific patient intensity of a bird that is not transiting through and is not confused and is not lost, was a bald eagle. This was not, on its face, an extraordinary event. Bald eagles exist in Arizona. They nest there. They have a small but documented breeding population concentrated in the Central Highlands, around the lakes and river systems of the upper Sonoran zone, at elevations and in habitats that ecologically resemble the forested lakeshores and river corridors where the species built its North American recovery over the past 4 decades. But Krebs was not in the Central Highlands. She was standing on the edge of the Sonoran Desert proper, in the lower Salt River Canyon, at an elevation below 1,000 feet, in late April, in temperatures that were already pushing toward the 90s, in a landscape that is dominated by saguaro cacti, palo verde trees, and the baked geological substrate of one of the hottest and driest places on the continent. And the eagle she was looking at was not a bald eagle behaving the way bald eagles behave when they show up in the wrong place by accident. It was sitting in that tree with the settled, proprietary quality of an animal that has decided it belongs there. If you have found this kind of content before, the deep dive examinations of things happening in the natural world that do not fit the maps we have drawn for them, make sure you subscribe now so you do not miss what is coming next, because the story we are getting into today is one of the stranger and more consequential ecological puzzles being actively worked right now, and it is happening in a place almost no one would have predicted. The bald eagle is one of the most successful conservation stories in American history. That sentence has been written so many times and in so many contexts that it has acquired the quality of a historical monument, something that everyone acknowledges and no one really examines anymore. But the underlying biological reality that the sentence points to is genuinely extraordinary and deserves to be understood carefully before we get into what is happening in Arizona, because the Arizona situation only makes sense against the backdrop of what bald eagles actually are, where they actually came from, and what the history of their relationship to the North American landscape actually looks like. Bald eagles were not always a symbol of resilience. There was a period, roughly from the 1940s through the early 1970s, when the bald eagle was on a trajectory that ornithologists studying the species were privately convinced would end in extinction, or something close to it, across most of the lower 48 states. The cause was not habitat destruction, at least not primarily. It was not hunting, though eagles were shot in significant numbers for decades before federal protection arrived. The cause was a synthetic pesticide called dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, which we know as DDT, and the mechanism by which it nearly eliminated the bald eagle from the contiguous United States was one of the more elegant and horrifying examples of ecological chain consequence ever documented. DDT did not kill eagles directly, though it was toxic in sufficient concentrations. What it did was accumulate in the food chain in a process called biomagnification, concentrating in fatty tissues at each trophic level until it reached the fish-eating birds at the top of aquatic food webs at concentrations millions of times higher than those present in the water itself. At those concentrations, DDT interfered with calcium metabolism in ways that made eggshells thin. The eggs of bald eagles, osprey, peregrine falcons, and brown pelicans were collapsing under the weight of incubating parents who had no way to know that the shells holding their eggs were 10 times more fragile than they should have been. The reproductive failure was catastrophic and nearly silent. The birds were still there, still nesting, still incubating. They just were not producing young that survived. By 1963, the bald eagle population in the lower 48 states had dropped to an estimated 417 nesting pairs. 417 pairs across the entire continental United States, for a species that had been estimated in the millions at the time of European contact. DDT was banned in 1972. The Endangered Species Act passed in 1973. Bald eagle recovery programs combined captive rearing, habitat protection, and the elimination of the contaminant that had caused the collapse. The population response was slow at first, and then accelerating, and then dramatic. By 2006, when the species was delisted from the endangered species list, the nesting pair count had grown from 417 to nearly 10,000. By 2020, estimates of the total bald eagle population in the lower 48 states had reached approximately 316,700 individuals. The recovery was not just a restoration, it was an overshoot. The bald eagle population of the lower 48 states is, by most measures, larger today than it has been at any point in the last century, and possibly longer. When a large, powerful, wide-ranging species recovers at that scale and continues to grow, something happens that is predictable in retrospect, but often not anticipated in the moment. The species starts doing things it was not doing before. It starts showing up in places it was not before. It starts using habitats and ranges and seasonal patterns that do not match the ones established during the recovery period or catalogued in the field guides that were written during or shortly after that period. This is not unusual in ecology. It happens with deer, with wolves, with coyotes, with white pelicans, with sandhill cranes. When a population grows beyond the capacity of its historical range to absorb it, individuals begin probing the margins, exploring adjacent habitats, attempting to establish themselves in areas where the species has not been seen or has not persisted. Some of these probes fail, some succeed. The ones that succeed begin to look, within a generation or two, like normal range rather than anomaly. The bald eagle's documented range expansion over the past 20 years is one of the most geographically extensive of any large bird species in North America. Eagles have established nesting populations in areas of the American Southeast where they had not bred in living memory. They have colonized the Great Plains at densities not seen historically. They have begun appearing along river systems in the American Southwest in numbers and at times of year that do not fit historical patterns of migration or wintering. And in Arizona's Sonoran Desert, specifically in the lower river corridors and reservoir systems of the Valley of the Sun and its surrounding lowlands, they have been showing up in ways that have been quietly astonishing wildlife observers and professional biologists for several years now, and that in 2022 and 2023 crossed a threshold from interesting anomaly into something that requires a more systematic explanation. The historical picture of bald eagles in Arizona requires some careful framing, because the state does have a bald eagle population and always has, during the historical period of European observation, had a modest one. Arizona's breeding bald eagles are part of what has been called the southwestern bald eagle population, a distinct segment of the species concentrated in the central Arizona highlands, centered on the lakes and rivers of the Mogollon Rim country, places like Roosevelt Lake, Apache Lake, Canyon Lake, and the Verde River system above its lower desert reaches. This population uses habitat that is structurally similar to the core of the bald eagle's continental range, large water bodies surrounded by forested or wooded terrain at elevations that moderate the temperature extremes of the surrounding desert country. At its lowest ebb, during the DDT era, the Arizona breeding population fell to somewhere around 5 to 11 nesting pairs. By the early 2020s, it had recovered to more than 40 active nests, with a total Arizona breeding population of perhaps 80 to 100 individuals, when non-breeding adults, subadults, and floaters are included. The birds that began appearing in the lower Sonoran Desert are different from these highland breeders in a specific and important way. They are not using the highland habitats. They are not showing up at Roosevelt Lake or the Verde River's upper reach. They are appearing along the lower Salt River, between the Granite Reef Dam and the river's confluence with the Gila, along the lower Verde, below the Horseshoe and Bartlett reservoirs as they transition into desert terrain, at the reservoirs of the Phoenix metropolitan area's fringe, Saguaro Lake, Canyon Lake in its lower approach areas, and along the stretches of the Gila River that flow, at least seasonally, through the flat desert country south and west of the city. These are not highland eagle habitats. They are low desert riparian corridors, in some of the hottest, driest terrain on the continent, at elevations that in summer routinely produce air temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a stretch. And the birds are not just passing through. That is the critical observation that separates what has been documented in the Arizona lowlands from ordinary range-edge wandering. Eagles passing through a habitat, they are not suited to look different, behaviorally, from eagles that have found a habitat that works for them. Transient birds are restless, directionally mobile, not consistently associated with specific locations or resources. They land, they rest, they leave. The eagles being documented in the Sonoran Desert lowland river corridors are behaving differently. They are returning to the same roost sites week after week and month after month. They are associating with specific stretches of river or specific reservoir margins, with the territorial fidelity that characterizes eagles that have found productive foraging territory. They are present not just during the cool season months, when winter-wandering birds from northern populations sometimes appear in Arizona, but through the spring, and in some documented cases, through the summer. And in the monitoring data that has been accumulating from multiple observers, researchers, and eBird reports since around 2019, the number of individual birds showing these patterns of residency in the lowland desert sites has been increasing year over year. The roosting behavior specifically is what has drawn the most focused attention from the ornithologists trying to understand what is happening. Roosting, in the context of large raptors, is not simply sleeping. It is a socially organized, site-faithful behavior that reflects something important about how a bird relates to a particular piece of landscape. Bald eagles that are using an area as genuine foraging and resting habitat develop roost sites, specific trees or structures that they return to repeatedly and often share with other eagles. Communal roosts, where multiple individuals gather in the same trees at the same locations over extended periods, are among the clearest behavioral signatures that a species is not transiting through an area, but inhabiting it. And communal roosts of bald eagles have now been documented at multiple sites in the lower Sonoran Desert of central and southern Arizona, in ways that, as recently as a decade ago, would have been considered essentially impossible, given what was understood about the species' habitat requirements. To understand why this is strange in the way that it is strange, and not merely unusual in the way that individual wandering birds showing up far outside their normal range are unusual, it is necessary to understand something about what the Sonoran Desert is. The Sonoran Desert is not simply a hot, dry place. It is a specific, ancient, extraordinarily complex biome with a climate regime, a plant community, and an ecological structure that are unlike any other desert system in the world. It is the only place on Earth where the giant saguaro cactus grows. Its plant communities are defined by a bimodal precipitation pattern that delivers both winter rains from Pacific storm systems and summer monsoon moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, producing a biotic richness that makes the Sonoran Desert the most ecologically diverse desert on the planet. It is home to an extraordinary diversity of reptiles, mammals, birds, and invertebrates that have evolved specifically to function in its temperature and moisture regimes. And it is hot. Genuinely, profoundly, consistently hot in ways that impose metabolic and physiological constraints on any warm-blooded animal attempting to live and function within it. The metabolic cost of thermoregulation in Sonoran summer temperatures is significant for a bird the size of a bald eagle, which can weigh between 6 and 14 pounds and maintains a body temperature around 104 to 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Managing that body temperature when the ambient air temperature reaches 115 degrees requires behavioral and physiological strategies that are not part of the standard bald eagle toolkit, or weren't. The behavioral strategies being documented in the desert resident eagles are precisely what has caught the attention of researchers who are trying to figure out whether what is happening is a genuine, durable ecological shift or a temporary artifact of unusual conditions. The eagles, using the lower desert river corridors, are not behaving like transplanted northern birds trying to cope with conditions they are not built for. They are behaving like animals that have figured something out. They are roosting in riparian cottonwoods and sycamores along the river channels, where evapotranspiration from the dense tree canopy creates a microclimate that can be 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the surrounding desert. They are foraging in the early morning and late afternoon, during the thermal windows when the physiological cost of activity is lowest. They are spending the hottest midday hours perched in deep shade with specific postures, wings slightly drooped, bill open, that facilitate heat dissipation. These are not random behaviors. They are the behavioral signatures of thermoregulatory competence in a hot environment, of animals that have learned, individually or culturally, how to live in this landscape rather than pass through it. The food resource that is supporting the desert lowland eagles is the element of the story that provides the most concrete ecological rationale for why this range expansion is happening here and now, rather than somewhere else or some other time. The lower Salt River below Saguaro Lake is, by the standards of Arizona desert hydrology, a remarkably productive fish habitat. The river in this stretch supports populations of common carp that in some surveys have been described as extraordinarily dense, along with channel catfish, largemouth bass, sunfish species, and the introduced tilapia that has colonized warm water river systems across the southwest and now constitutes a significant proportion of the aquatic biomass in many lowland Arizona waterways. Tilapia, in particular, deserve attention in this context because they are extraordinarily relevant to the bald eagle situation in the Sonoran Desert in ways that are probably not coincidental. Tilapia are warm water fish, native to Africa and the Middle East, introduced into Arizona water systems decades ago as a biological control agent for aquatic vegetation, and subsequently released or escaped into the broader waterway network. They thrive in water temperatures that would stress or kill the cold water species that most bald eagles in North America have evolved to exploit. They tolerate the high water temperatures of Sonoran desert rivers in summer, reaching densities in the warm, shallow margins of these systems that produce an easily accessible, high biomass food source at precisely the time of year when most other fish in the system are less available or behaviorally less vulnerable to aerial predation. Tilapia are also, relative to the trout and salmon that anchor the diet of most North American bald eagle populations, relatively easy to catch. They aggregate in shallow water. They are not strongly evasive. A large raptor hunting a dense school of tilapia in a shallow, clear-water desert river is engaging in a fundamentally different and energetically much more favorable interaction than one hunting dispersed, fast-moving salmonids in a turbulent mountain river. The hypothesis that is gaining the most traction among the ornithologists examining the desert eagle phenomenon is one that links the tilapia resource to the residency pattern directly. Eagles that discovered the tilapia-rich stretches of the lower desert river system found a food resource abundant enough to support year-round residency and productive enough to offset the metabolic cost of living in hot desert conditions. Those eagles stayed. Some of them may have bred, or at least explored breeding, in the desert lowlands. And other eagles, observing or following experienced individuals, learned the route and the resource, and began using it themselves. This kind of information transfer about food resources among large, long-lived, intelligent birds is well documented and probably underlies a substantial portion of range expansion events across raptor species globally. Eagles are not social in the way that crows or ravens are, but they are observant, and they are capable of responding to the behavior of conspecifics in ways that can accelerate the spread of novel foraging behaviors through a population. The year-round presence is the detail that matters most from an ecological standpoint. Bald eagles in the western United States have historically shown a strong latitudinal migration pattern, with northern populations moving south in winter and returning north in spring, and a similarly strong elevational pattern, with birds in mountainous states like Arizona descending from highland breeding areas to lower elevations in winter and returning to high-elevation nesting sites in spring. The framework for understanding bald eagle distribution in Arizona has been built almost entirely around these patterns. Winter influx of migrants from northern breeding populations, year-round residency of the highland breeding population at middle elevations, and the desert lowlands as a zone essentially outside the species' operational envelope, except perhaps during brief cold season passages. What the monitoring data from the lower Sonoran desert sites is showing is that this framework is no longer accurate, and has not been fully accurate for at least 5 to 7 years. The year-round roosting, specifically the presence of adult bald eagles at consistent roost sites through the months of May, June, July, and August, when temperatures in the Sonoran Desert are at their most extreme, and when the historical model of eagle distribution would predict the species to be absent, or nearly so, is a direct, empirical contradiction of the framework. It is not a subtle anomaly. It is not a single bird in an unusual year. It is a pattern involving multiple individual birds at multiple sites in multiple consecutive years, and the pattern is intensifying rather than stabilizing or reversing. The breeding question is the one that generates the most cautious language from the researchers who are closest to the data. Documentation of year-round residency in a previously unoccupied habitat does not automatically mean that breeding is occurring or is imminent. Large raptors have long pre-breeding dispersal and exploration phases, particularly for subadult and young adult individuals who may occupy and persistently use habitat for 1 to several years before they attempt to breed or find mates. The desert resident eagles include a proportion of subadult birds identifiable by their mottled brown and white plumage that are too young to breed, regardless of habitat suitability. But the proportion of adult birds in full white head and tail breeding plumage showing consistent desert lowland roosting behavior has increased in the documented record. And, at least one location along the lower Salt River, a pair of adults in breeding plumage were observed engaging in courtship-associated behaviors, including mutual soaring and food transfer flights, during the winter and early spring of 2023. Whether that pair attempted to nest, and whether any nest attempt that might have occurred produced eggs or young, is not currently documented in the published literature. But it is the question that multiple observers and at least one formal research group are now actively trying to answer. The distinction between year-round roosting and year-round breeding matters enormously for how we interpret what is happening. Year-round roosting, without breeding, could represent a kind of ecological exploration, non-reproducing individuals discovering and using a resource-rich habitat without yet establishing the full suite of behaviors that constitute residency in the biological sense. It is interesting, it is worth documenting, and it suggests something is changing, but it does not necessarily mean the desert lowlands are becoming bald eagle habitat in a permanent, self-sustaining way. Breeding changes everything. If eagles are successfully raising young in the Sonoran desert lowlands, then the desert is not just being explored by adventurous individuals from established highland populations. It is being colonized. The young raised there will have behavioral templates calibrated to that habitat from their earliest weeks of life. They will not be highland birds that have adapted to the desert. They will be desert birds, period. Their habitat selection as adults, their behavioral strategies, their prey preferences will all be shaped by the conditions in which they were raised, not by some ancestral template from a different elevation and a different climate. The parallel with what has happened in other raptor species during range expansion events is instructive here. Peregrine falcons in North America, another DDT recovery success story, began colonizing urban environments during the 1980s and 1990s in ways that were initially treated as interesting anomalies and are now understood as a fundamental component of the species' distribution. Urban peregrines are not simply rural peregrines that have moved into cities. They are, in measurable behavioral and dietary ways, urban specialists whose descendants will continue to use urban environments because that is what they know and where they were raised. The behavioral and ecological legacy of early colonizers in novel habitats propagates through generations in ways that make the initial colonization event far more consequential than it appears at the time. The Sonoran Desert is not an ordinary novel habitat from the perspective of a species attempting to colonize it, and the challenges that desert-resident bald eagles face are not trivial. The thermal environment alone imposes constraints that would kill birds that had not developed effective strategies to manage it. But the evidence suggests that the eagles now consistently present in the desert lowlands have developed those strategies, which raises a question that is in some ways the most fascinating and least answerable one in this entire story. How did they develop them? Where did those strategies come from? There are three possible sources for the thermoregulatory and foraging behavioral strategies that desert-resident eagles are demonstrating. Individual learning is the first and most straightforward. An eagle that finds itself in an unusually hot environment and survives long enough to learn what works, what roost microhabitats are coolest, what foraging timing minimizes heat load, what prey types and locations offer the best caloric return per unit of thermoregulatory cost, will develop a functional behavioral profile through its own trial and error. The learning capacity of bald eagles is substantial. They are long-lived birds, routinely reaching 20 to 30 years in the wild, with the kind of extended individual learning trajectory that allows for the development and refinement of sophisticated behavioral strategies over time. Social learning from other individuals is the second source. Eagles are observational learners. Young birds in their first years of life spend substantial time near experienced adults, and the evidence from multiple raptor species suggests that foraging strategies, roost site selection, and habitat use patterns can be transmitted from more experienced to less experienced individuals through observation and following behavior. If a small number of pioneer eagles developed effective desert strategies through individual learning, those strategies could spread to other birds that associated with them, accelerating the population-level shift in desert habitat use beyond what individual learning alone could produce. Phenotypic plasticity, the third and most speculative source, is the possibility that there is variation within the bald eagle population in the degree to which individual birds are physiologically buffered against heat stress, and that selection in the desert environment is favoring the more heat-tolerant end of that variation. This is a hypothesis that would require genetic and physiological data to evaluate meaningfully, and that data does not currently exist for the Arizona desert eagle population. But it is not implausible. Physiological variation in thermal tolerance exists in many bird species, and a novel selective environment like the Sonoran desert would, over multiple generations of successful breeding, tend to concentrate heat-tolerant individuals if that variation has a heritable genetic basis. The climate context of this story is impossible to avoid and would be irresponsible to sidestep, not because it provides a simple explanatory framework that closes the question, but because it is genuinely relevant to understanding why this is happening now rather than 20 years ago or 50 years ago. The Sonoran Desert is experiencing documented climatic change at a rate that has been measured and published by multiple research institutions. Average temperatures in the Phoenix metropolitan area have increased by several degrees Fahrenheit over the past half-century, driven by a combination of regional climate warming and the urban heat island effect produced by the expansion of one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. Winter temperatures, specifically, have been trending warmer, which is relevant to the eagle situation because winter is the season when northern migrant eagles historically used Arizona lowland habitats in their greatest numbers, and when the thermal constraints on year-round desert residency are least severe. But the relationship between climate change and the eagle situation is more nuanced than a simple warming story would suggest. In some respects, warming should make the Sonoran Desert less hospitable to a large endothermic bird, not more, by increasing the thermal load during summer and reducing the period during which the desert's thermal environment falls within the zone of comfortable thermoregulatory management for a bird of the bald eagle's size. The fact that eagle residency is apparently increasing despite, or alongside, documented warming trends suggests that the food resource story is probably more primary than the temperature story. The tilapia populations in the lower desert rivers are a relatively recent and rapidly growing phenomenon. The fish were present but less abundant in the lower Salt River system in the early 2000s. Their expansion through the warm water river network of the Arizona lowlands has been documented and corresponds roughly in timing with the emergence of the desert eagle residency pattern. This coincidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, but it points toward food availability as the proximate driver of the distribution shift, with climate operating as a secondary modifier of the constraints that would otherwise prevent the shift from occurring. The human dimensions of this story are entangled with the ecological ones in ways that matter for understanding both what is happening and what might happen next. The lower Salt River, below Saguaro Lake, is not a remote wilderness. It is an extraordinarily heavily used recreation corridor within the Phoenix metropolitan area. The river's tubing, kayaking, swimming, and shoreline recreation economy draws millions of visitors annually and has generated intense local interest in the wildlife of the corridor, including the eagles. The documentation of bald eagle roosting behavior in this stretch of the river has benefited enormously from the density of experienced amateur observers who spend time there, including birders who have been tracking individual birds through plumage characteristics and behavioral associations for multiple seasons. The relationship between heavy human recreation use and eagle roosting behavior is not straightforwardly negative, which is itself an interesting observation. Eagles that are using roost sites in the cottonwood galleries of the lower Salt River are doing so in a landscape where hundreds of people are passing through the river channel every weekend during the cool season, and substantial numbers even in summer. The fact that the eagles are maintaining roost fidelity in this context rather than abandoning sites due to disturbance suggests a degree of habituation to human presence that is not characteristic of the species in most of its range. Bald eagles are known to be sensitive to disturbance at nest sites and to show flight response to human approach at distances of several hundred meters in relatively undisturbed habitats. The desert river eagles appear to have a significantly reduced disturbance threshold, tolerating the passage of kayakers and tubers at distances that would flush most bald eagles in more remote settings. This habituation to human presence is, in one sense, an ecological success story, evidence that wildlife populations can adapt to intensive human land use in ways that allow them to persist and potentially thrive in human-dominated landscapes. In another sense, it raises questions about what it means for long-term population health if the desert resident eagle population becomes dependent on a heavily modified, human-dominated river corridor with a food base built largely on an introduced species. The lower Salt River is not a pristine ecological system. It is a managed waterway whose flow regime is controlled by upstream dam operations, whose fish community is dominated by introduced species, and whose riparian vegetation, while locally dense and ecologically functional, exists in a matrix of urban and suburban development that constrains its long-term trajectory in ways that a truly wild river system would not. Eagles that are adapted to this specific habitat configuration are not simply colonizing the desert, they are colonizing a particular kind of human-modified desert landscape, and the sustainability of that colonization depends in part on decisions that humans will make about water management, invasive species control, and riparian land use that have nothing to do with eagle conservation and everything to do with the competing priorities of a rapidly growing desert metropolis. The tilapia question is particularly pointed in this context. Tilapia are not universally beloved in Arizona's waterways. They are an invasive species that competes with native fish for food and space, and there have been periodic discussions among fisheries managers about control or elimination programs that would reduce tilapia populations in affected river segments. If tilapia were significantly reduced in the lower Salt River through active management, the food resource that appears to be supporting desert resident eagles would be substantially diminished. The eagles might stay anyway, shifting to alternative prey. They might reduce in number, with the desert lowland population settling at a lower level, supported by remaining resources. Or they might abandon the desert corridors and return to the highland habitats from which they, or their ancestors, dispersed. The management decision about tilapia in this waterway system is not a decision about eagles, but it has direct implications for eagle distribution and population dynamics in a way that has not been formally acknowledged or evaluated in the public record of either the fisheries or the raptor management literature. The native fish dimension of this conversation deserves careful attention because it sits at the intersection of two conservation concerns that do not always point in the same direction. Arizona's native aquatic fauna includes several species of fish that are among the most imperiled freshwater vertebrates in North America. The razorback sucker, the bony-tailed chub, the Colorado pike minnow, and the desert pupfish are species whose populations have been decimated by the combined effects of habitat alteration, water diversion, and competition from, and predation by, introduced fish species. Tilapia are among the competitors and habitat modifiers that contribute to the difficult conditions these native species face in the lower desert river systems. An eagle population sustained by tilapia is, in this light, a predator whose food base is partly an ecological threat to native fish conservation. The eagle is not responsible for the tilapia's presence or its effects on native fish. But the relationship between the eagle's desert colonization and the presence of introduced fish creates an ecological situation where one conservation success story, the growing bald eagle population expanding into novel habitat, is entangled with one conservation failure story, the collapse of native desert fish due to introduced species, in a way that resists simple narrative. Whether eagles significantly predate native desert fish is a question that requires dietary analysis data that does not yet exist in published form for the Arizona lowland population. Eagles are opportunistic foragers that take the most easily caught fish of adequate size in the habitats they use. In a waterway where tilapia are by far the most abundant and most easily caught fish, it is reasonable to assume that tilapia dominate the eagle's diet. But eagles also take native species where they are available and accessible, and the net ecological effect of the eagle's presence in the desert lowland fish community across all the prey species involved is a quantitative question that has not been answered. The monitoring infrastructure that exists for tracking what is happening with bald eagles in the Arizona desert lowlands is, at present, a patchwork of citizen science contributions, opportunistic research observations, and a small number of more formal monitoring efforts that have not yet produced the kind of comprehensive, multi-year dataset that would allow ecologists to draw firm conclusions about population size, residency duration, habitat fidelity, or breeding status. eBird Data, the crowd-sourced bird observation platform maintained by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, provides the broadest temporal and spatial coverage of eagle sightings in the region, and the trend in that data is unmistakable. The frequency and duration of bald eagle reports from lowland Sonoran desert sites in Arizona has increased substantially over the past decade, and the proportion of those reports that fall in the summer months, which are the months that would be most ecologically significant if they indicate year-round residency, has increased disproportionately. But eBird data has limitations as a source of ecological insight. Observer effort is not controlled. Sightings of the same individual bird by different observers can be counted as separate events. The distinction between a transient bird and a resident bird is not something that casual observation can reliably make without the kind of individual identification that requires detailed plumage documentation or marking. What the desert eagle situation needs, from a scientific standpoint, is the kind of intensive, individually based monitoring that has been applied to other eagle populations, and that the technology of the moment makes more feasible than it has ever been. GPS telemetry, using the lightweight solar-powered transmitters that have transformed raptor movement ecology over the past 15 years, could answer within a single field season the questions that years of casual observation have been unable to resolve definitively. Trapping and marking individual eagles at the desert roost sites, fitting them with transmitters, and tracking their movements through a full annual cycle would reveal whether these birds are genuine desert residents that spend their entire year in the lowland habitat, whether they are highland breeders that make seasonal forays to the desert for specific foraging windows, or whether they are northern migrants that are arriving earlier and staying later than historical patterns would predict, creating the impression of year-round desert presence through an extension of the migratory residency period rather than true year-round occupation. None of these three scenarios is impossible, and the observational data currently available cannot definitively distinguish among them. The telemetry study is a straightforward and relatively inexpensive scientific undertaking. It has not yet been done at the scale needed to answer the central question, which itself says something about the pace at which monitoring science keeps up with ecological change at the edges of species ranges. The broader context of raptor range expansion in the American Southwest adds depth to the Arizona eagle story by placing it within a larger pattern that is operating across multiple species simultaneously. The Southwest is experiencing what some ornithologists have begun describing as a raptor renaissance, a period of range expansion, habitat colonization, and behavioral novelty across multiple large raptor species that reflects both the long-term benefits of regulatory protection from the Endangered Species Act era and the more recent demographic pressure generated by growing populations pressing against the carrying capacity of historically occupied habitats. Osprey, which like bald eagles are fish-eating specialists whose recovery from DDT has been dramatic and continent-wide, have been colonizing desert lowland water bodies in Arizona and New Mexico in ways that parallel the eagle situation. Great horned owls have extended their range into desert habitats they historically used only marginally. Harris's hawks, a cooperative hunting desert specialist, have expanded northward from their Sonoran strongholds into lowland habitats in southern Arizona, where they were previously absent or rare. The overall trajectory is one of increasing raptor diversity and abundance in desert waterway habitats that are being enhanced by the same combination of water management, introduced fish populations, and riparian vegetation development that seems to be supporting the desert eagle residency. The implications of this broader raptor expansion for native wildlife communities in the desert lowlands are not fully evaluated. The prey communities of these waterways, including native and introduced fish, waterbirds, and the small mammals of the riparian zone, are experiencing increased predation pressure from a growing suite of large avian predators. Whether that predation pressure is ecologically significant, whether it is affecting prey population dynamics in ways that matter for the waterway's ecological integrity, is an open question. What is clear is that the lower desert river system is becoming something different from what it was 2 decades ago. A more densely colonized, more biologically complex, more ecologically productive place in at least some respects, shaped by a combination of human water management, the establishment of introduced species, and the return of apex predators to habitats from which they had been historically absent. The Sonoran Desert itself has a long and complex history with bald eagles that predates European observation, and that is documented in the archaeological and paleontological record in ways that are relevant to interpreting what is currently happening. Pleistocene fossil deposits from desert lowland sites in Arizona include bald eagle remains, suggesting that the species used desert habitats during the Pleistocene, presumably during climatic periods when those habitats supported greater biological productivity than they do under current conditions. Indigenous peoples of the Sonoran Desert region, including the Oadam and their ancestors, had cultural relationships with bald eagles that are documented in oral tradition, ceremonial practice, and material culture, and that suggest the species was not entirely absent from desert environments in the pre-European period, even if it was less common and less consistently distributed than in the forested and montane habitats of the continental interior. The current desert colonization is not, in this deeper historical frame, a species invading an ecologically inappropriate environment. It may be, in some respects, a species returning to a range that was part of its historical distribution during periods when the ecological conditions were right, and that is becoming ecologically appropriate again for reasons that are partly natural and partly a product of human modification of the desert water system. This historical depth does not make what is happening now less significant or less worthy of careful study. If anything, it makes it more so, because it suggests that the eagle's relationship to the Sonoran Desert is not a simple story of a species venturing into alien territory. It is a story of a species whose ecological relationship with this landscape has fluctuated across timescales longer than the historical record, and that is currently reasserting a presence in response to conditions that may be more favorable than at any point in several centuries. Understanding that trajectory, tracking it rigorously, and making management decisions that account for both the ecological opportunity it represents and the conservation complexities it introduces, is work that needs to happen now, while the colonization is recent enough that the data collection is still tractable and the management options still numerous. The people who are watching the desert eagles most closely, the birders who spend hours at the lower Salt River roost sites, the photographers who have built extensive individual photographic records of returning birds across multiple seasons, the local naturalists who have been tracking the pattern long enough to know that it is real and not seasonal and not random, are doing something genuinely important and genuinely undervalued. They are generating the observational foundation on which any serious scientific understanding of this phenomenon will have to be built. The gap between what they know and what the formal scientific literature currently acknowledges is substantial, and it reflects the general lag between ecological change at the edges of species ranges and the institutional scientific response to that change. By the time a peer-reviewed paper documenting year-round bald eagle residency in the Sonoran desert lowlands appears in print, the phenomenon it documents will already be years old, already more developed, already further along its ecological trajectory than the paper can address. That lag is not a criticism of the scientists who study these birds. It is a structural feature of how ecological knowledge is generated and validated. But it means that the most current and granular understanding of what is happening in the Arizona desert with bald eagles lives right now, not in the scientific literature, but in the field notes and photograph archives and eBird accounts of the observers who are there regularly and who have been watching long enough to know what the trend looks like. Their knowledge is real, and it matters, and it deserves to be taken seriously by the institutions that will eventually have to make management decisions based on it. There is something worth sitting with at the end of this story that resists easy summarization. The bald eagle is one of the few genuinely iconic North American wildlife conservation successes. Its recovery from the brink of extirpation in the lower 48 states is an achievement that involved decades of scientific work, legislative protection, and ecological monitoring, and that produced an outcome that was not certain when the work began. The bird that almost disappeared from the continental United States is now, 50 years later, showing up in one of the places on the continent it was least expected to go, in one of the hottest and most extreme landscapes in North America, roosting year-round in cottonwoods along desert rivers, catching tilapia in water that would be lethal to the cold-water fish it evolved to hunt, sitting in deep shade through summer afternoons in temperatures that should, by any reasonable prior expectation, have driven it back to the highlands long ago. And it is staying. That fact, the simple fact that it is staying, is the most significant thing about the Arizona desert eagle situation. Not the oddity of seeing a large, white-headed raptor against a backdrop of saguaros. Not the aesthetically jarring quality of an image that does not fit the ecological map we carry in